Thank you, Todd. Okay. Hello, everybody. By way of introduction tonight, I have a great story to share with you. It has a sad beginning, but a great ending. As many of you know, Rose and I lost our sister 45 days ago to a brain aneurysm. But we knew that she collected a lot of beautiful Asian things, but we didn't have any idea just how many, and we were overwhelmed. And so what we did is we reached out to various people, and one of those was the person that's in charge of the East Asian studies at Pitt. And so we had her come here for dinner before we took her to the home. And so we were asking her a couple questions. This is Dr. Elizabeth Euler. And so we asked her a couple questions. Rosie's saying, where did you grow up? Pittsburgh. Where did you go to high school? Mount Lebanon. Oh, did you know Todd DePastino? She said, did I know Todd? She says, well, we went all through school together. And then it was my turn, and I said, well, was he always so smart and kind like he is now? And she said, yes. She says, everybody thought he was going to be president. Then I said, Beth, why didn't you marry him? And she says, because he married his high school sweetheart. And I said, oh, how was she? And she said, just as smart and as beautiful as he is. So ladies and gentlemen, maybe our future president, Todd DePastino.
Thank you so much, Mim. Yes, I know Beth well, I remember her well, and I gotta say, how do I put this? She was too smart for me. And I really mean that. Like, she was the one you knew would become like a nuclear scientist, or just should win a Pulitzer Prize or something like that. And she's gone on to pretty much do that. She's a really remarkable scholar and a wonderful person. Yes. Because great scholars don't always make great people. But she's both. I love Beth. Two things. First of all, I'm with the Veterans Breakfast Club. I founded the Veterans Breakfast Club. I publish this magazine every quarter. This is our spring magazine. And listen, I know you're going to open it up, you're going to look at the font or the print size, and you're going to say it's too small. And I'm so sorry about that. What a mistake. I didn't check it in the copy editing because it was digital, and I just blew it up so I could read it. My daughter lays out the magazine. And I said, don't you think the print is too small? She said, fine for me. So it won't happen again. But it is worth the reading. This is, as you know, with the Veterans Breakfast Club, with our BBC magazine, we publish the stories that we hear on our programs online and on our programs in person, and publish them every quarter. This was different. We decided we wanted to do, me being a historian, I wanted to do something having to honor America 250. And I started going back, this is kind of interesting. I used to teach the American Revolution, and I remember teaching a couple memoirs from the American Revolution and being very taken with the memoirs of soldiers who fought in the American Revolution. And I went back to read them again and also to look up other memoirs, and it turns out there weren't many memoirs. It's really interesting. The first memoirs of the American Revolution were published in like the late 1820s, just after the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which was a big deal, and the realization, oh my gosh, these soldiers are dying. We're losing them. We're losing these stories. Nobody was interested in American Revolution stories in the 1780s, 1790s, early 1800s, and that's because the country was in crisis that whole time. People didn't celebrate the American Revolution. They didn't celebrate the War of Independence because it looked like this new country, which just had been created, was probably going to collapse. So there wasn't this aura around the founders and around the founding generation that there later became in the 1820s after it was established that, this country's, after the War of 1812 especially, that there was the realization this country is going to make it, and we're in for the long term. So in the 1830s, 1840s, you start getting these memoirs that come out, and I read them again, and I hadn't read them really since I had since I stopped teaching. I used to teach college, as you know, and and I haven't read these things since I started working with veterans. And what struck me is how similar these veteran stories are to those that I hear at our breakfasts. It's like I could picture these guys in a way that I never could have before. You know, this guy's explaining, why did you join the Army when you were 17 years old? Well, I got into a fight with my parents. And I left town, and there was a recruiter who gave me $1. And he told me that he would give me a rifle. And I said, sign me up. And off he went. And then you have the first story of combat, the first seeing the wounded, the first time bullets are flying. All the experiences, or the first time at sea. All the experiences I hear from our veterans are in these stories. And so I selected excerpts from various memoirs that I thought our veterans would be able to see themselves in. And I really encourage you, no matter how small the print is, if you have a magnifying glass, to read at least some of it. And I think you'll be as engaged with these people as I am. The man on the cover is, he was over 100 years old when this photo was taken. It was taken by a man in Connecticut who decided to, this is 1864, he wanted to find surviving Revolutionary War veterans. He was able to locate 12 of them, and he interviewed and photographed 6 of them. He's one of the 6. And he said in this book, he published a book in 1864, the lives of these 6 Revolutionary War veterans. He said, you know, these are men who are hard of hearing, they have some dementia, but when you ask them about the war, man, they could chapter and verse, they remember every moment. And just like the wealth of knowledge that these men had, and the wealth of experience and wisdom and insight. So it just absolutely reminded, what it reminded me is that, you know, history really is this wonderful, really miraculous continuum that we're a part of. It's this stream that we're a part of, and we're in it for a moment, and then it passes on to the next generations. But you really can connect, make direct lines of connection with people in the past, and I love that very much. Tonight I'm starting a long series on the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, one of the most important and most divisive events in 20th century American history. It was a long war, and it was fought intensively between 1965 and 1973, so 8 years. But I would argue, of course, being that who I am, that to really understand the war, you have to go back, you have to get deep into Vietnamese history and culture, and that's what we're going to do in this series. That's why it's going to take us through the end of the year. You're going to have it up to here with the Vietnam War by fall, you know? Because I'm doing the deep dive. I'm going way, way back. I think to understand the Vietnam War, you have to understand who we were fighting, who the Vietnamese were. And so I'm going to start with the ancient history and then bring us up to the war. And I'm going to start with that ancient history tonight. But before I started with the ancient history, I do, because we have some young people here who may not remember the Vietnam War, like Rose and Min. I do want to give a thumbnail sketch, very brief overview of what the Vietnam War was, how the U.S. got into it, and how we got out of it. How we got into it was we were dragged in by the French. The French colonized Vietnam in the 19th century, and they called it French Indochina. And French Indochina was made up of 3 places: Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. From the moment that the French arrived in the 1850s for the first time, they encountered resistance from the Vietnamese people. It took 30 years for France to conquer Vietnam, or to quell or pacify Vietnam. And even after that 30 years, it was constantly dealing with this insurgency, and there were many different kinds, many different groups rebelling against the French, but the most successful and the most famous were led by this guy. On the right, Ho Chi Minh, and his compatriot Vo Nguyen Giap, who's considered one of the greatest military minds of the 20th century. They started a resistance movement called the Viet Minh, and they waged war against the French. The war began after World War II. The French fought a war to keep Vietnam a colony for 8 years, from 1946 to 1954. We call it the First Indochina War. European historians continue to call today what we call the Vietnam War. In Europe, they refer to it as the Second Indochina War. They see the Vietnam War as just really a continuation of the French War, and in many ways it was. The war was a demoralizing stalemate for the French. It was really a wonder that they could not really win this war. They fought the Viet Minh to a stalemate, and I think this map kind of tells it all. It kind of tells the story of the war. This is Vietnam, or French Indochina, in 1954, at the end of 8 years of war. All the territory in orange is controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. All the territories in purple are controlled by the French.
In Vietnam, it's called the War of American Aggression.
Yeah, war of, or they call it the War of Resistance against the American Empire, but yeah, it's or they call it the American War for short. So yeah, wars. How you name a war? Oh my gosh, it is really important. How you name a war? It's really important. In other words, there's a big debate among historians whether the war that this country was involved in between 1775 and 1783 should be called the War of Independence or the American Revolution. Which was it? Which was it? Both. That's cheating. That's cheating. Yeah, it was both. That's the right answer. But yeah, this, how you name a war, this is called the First Indochina War, and here it is. After 8 years of warfare, you see that the Viet Minh, the insurgents, Ho Chi Minh's forces, they controlled most of the geography of the country. They controlled the countryside, but the French controlled Saigon, Nha Trang, Hue, Turin, which is Da Nang, Hanoi. The French controlled the cities. Ho Chi Minh controlled the countryside. The French controlled the day. Ho Chi Minh controlled the night. So at the end of 8 years of demoralizing stalemate, the French people encouraged their government to end this war. The French sued for peace. Peace negotiations began in May 1954 in Geneva, and by July they had hammered out a peace agreement. And the agreement was this: we will divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's forces will get the north. They can take it, they can have it. The French will get the south, and the French will then hand off the south to somebody else. It wasn't going to be them. They wouldn't have anything to do with it anymore. So they had to find Vietnamese people to stand up a new country in the south. And they knew that that new country needed a sponsor, a Western sponsor. And guess who the Western sponsor was? The United States of America. So we went in and built a nation in the south called the Republic of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh built a nation in the north called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. This was the Republic of Vietnam's colors. That was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's colors, the communist colors. This nation down here, we call it South Vietnam, or ARVin, the Republic of Vietnam. And it was a non-communist, Western-aligned state. And it struggled from the moment it was born. It struggled because there were insurgents in the South who wanted to overthrow this government that the United States had helped to stand up. Those insurgents got together in a guerrilla movement, a political movement first, and then it became an armed insurgency that they called themselves the National Liberation Front, the NLF. We called them the Viet Cong. Viet Cong, and that is a slang, that's Vietnamese slang for Vietnamese communist. Communists led this insurgency for sure. but the National Liberation Front also included non-communists who just opposed, it was a coalition, non-communists who opposed the regime in Saigon. These insurgents, the Viet Cong, they were not well armed, they were not well trained. There were plenty of them, but they were mainly, they tended to be, the most radical tended to be very radical communists. And they were filled with kind of revolutionary zeal. And they would fight at night, they would fight part-time. You know, this is actual photograph you can see of a Viet Cong guerrilla with his black outfit, and he's just wearing sandals, and he's wearing an old style, or he's carrying an old style rifle. You know, they're not really well trained or well armed, but they so destabilized the government in the South, that the government in the South had to request American help. And the Americans sent help, advisors, until finally 1965, we sent in on March 8th, actually 1965. I always taught my students this is a very important date in American history, because this is the date when 2,500 Marines from the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade landed on Red Beach, China Beach, Da Nang. And these are this is a picture of them. These are the first troops on the ground, American troops, on the ground in Vietnam, who were authorized for offensive operations against the Viet Cong. The previous service members who had been there, American service members, they were allowed to shoot back if they were shot at, but they couldn't go out and find the enemy and kill them. These guys could. This represented a turning point. This is when what we know of as the Vietnam War really begins. We enter a new era now, because from this day forward, more and more and more and more troops were added to the war. It was called escalation. You can see these are the troop count through the Vietnam War beginning in 1965 and ending here in 1975. American troops start to arrive, offensive troops, combat troops in 1965, and you can see it's a slow, gradual escalation. Do any of you remember former Secretary of State Dean Rusk?
Yes.
Remember what he looked like?
Yep.
Bald, yes, bald with big eyes. When my second daughter was born and she came out, my wife will always say this to me, always. I said, oh my gosh, she looks like Dean Rusk. And she said, who is he? What the hell are you talking about? Dean Rusk said this. He was years later, he was explaining, he was asked, you know, because we've learned about shock and awe, you know, we've learned that this might not be the best way to fight a war, kind of gradually, little by little, inch by inch. And he was asked, why did you do this? And he said, in a very memorable turn of phrase that I'll probably butcher, he said, we wanted today in the war to be not very different from yesterday. We didn't want any dramatic changes, little by little by little, every day, because we didn't want to scare the Soviets into overreacting or scare the Chinese into overreacting. And we wanted to see how much pressure, how much military pressure we really needed to put on the North to end their supply of the insurgency in the South. So we just tried a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. But over the years, you can see it grew from, you know, the first 2,500 in March 1965 to a peak of well over 500,000 in 1968. And then in 1968, something happened. Our country turned against the war very quickly, and we'll talk about why. Of course, it's the Tet Offensive in early 1968 that turned the country against the war. Our country's popular opinion against the war just plummeted in February 1968. And from that moment, both parties in the US agreed, we need to de-escalate. We need to start pulling troops out and find a way out of this war. And so the exact reverse of the escalation started to occur. De-escalation. Step down, fewer American troops, pulling them out, all the while trying to hand the war over entirely to the government of South Vietnam that we were supporting. Finally, on March 29th, 1973, the U.S. pulled its final troops out of Vietnam. That's it. And that's why March 29th is today, Vietnam Veterans Day. It's the day that the last American soldier came home from Vietnam. And here, the war is over. For the Americans, the war is over. The war continued on, but the war is over for the Americans. And the tally was pretty grim. 58,281 Americans killed over 8 years of war. 150,372 wounded and needed hospital care over 8 years of war. 1,582 went missing in action. 837 were taken as prisoner. 116 of those died in captivity. So this is the war. This is the American war. It's over, March 29th, 1973, but only for the Americans. For the Vietnamese, it very much continued. The fighting would continue for another 2 years until this moment, April 30th, 1975, when this Viet Cong tank, which is actually a North Vietnamese tank with a Viet Cong flag, gets flown in or gets driven in through the gates of the presidential palace, takes over the seat of the Saigon South Vietnamese government, and the war is over. South Vietnam has been conquered. North Vietnam, the insurgency has won, and the South Vietnamese government that this country stood up in 1954 collapses. That's it. We lost the Vietnam War. We lost the Vietnam War. My students would always bristle at that statement, we lost the Vietnam War. Because I would explain, we spent a class explaining the battles. And we won every battle. We had total air supremacy, pretty much total, during the Vietnam War. We had control of the seas in Vietnam War. The kill ratio, and this is a crude way of measuring, ground war prowess, but the kill ratio was like 10 to 1, 20 to 1. In other words, we killed 20 of them for every one of us. And my students would say, how could you say we lost? We didn't lose that war. And this was always a great teachable moment, because I would say, well, how do you measure success in war? You don't measure success in war by the success of a military operation. You don't measure success in war by how well you do in your tactics. You measure success in war by whether or not you've achieved your strategic objectives. You have to be able to state your strategic objectives. If you can't state what they are, you probably shouldn't be fighting the war until you figure out what they are. And then you have an easy measure. Did we achieve this objective or not? The strategic objective of the Vietnam War was to prevent any global expansion of communism and to prevent the fall of South Vietnam. The strategic objective of the Vietnam War was really very simple: to keep an independent, non-communist government in South Vietnam, period. The great military strategist Karl von Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And that's a wonderful way of looking at war. You negotiate, you deal, you use diplomacy, you use military power when you need to, but it's all part of this continuum where you're attempting to achieve strategic objectives. And so war is always political, and strategic objectives are always political. And we didn't achieve it in Vietnam, and that has haunted us ever since. Thousands and thousands of historians and experts and commentators and pundits have debated why we lost, how we lost. Yes?
That war should have ended in 72, but because of the election with Nixon, they kept it going for another year.
Yeah.
And that's over thousands of boys still died so that Nixon could win an election.
Well, we're going to talk about that. 1972 was a big year in the war. not remembered much here in the U.S. because there were not many Americans involved in that year in the war because the drawdown had been so great. But yeah, we will cover 1972. You know, we'll cover why it lasted for 8 years, how the drawdown was. And we'll also cover this question of why we lost. I happen to think this is not the most interesting question, or this is not the most interesting part of the Vietnam War. I think the most haunting and interesting part of the Vietnam War is that it destroyed us in a really profound way as a country. We lost our faith in our country. We lost our faith in our political leaders. We lost our faith in our political institutions, and I don't think we ever have recaptured it. Believe it or not, before 1968, believe it or not, from 1945 to 1968, Gallup poll, 75% of the American people said this: they trust that their political leaders will do the right thing most of the time. We've never come close to that since. 75%? 80% said they believe our political leaders tell the truth most of the time. We've never come close to that since. Vietnam disillusioned us, made us cynical. I think it broke us apart in a really profound way, and we're going to definitely talk about that. And I think one of the reasons, the deep reason maybe, that we lost the Vietnam War, and this may be a controversial statement I'm about to make, but I think one of the reasons that I think we lost was because we underestimated and we misunderstood who we were fighting. We misunderstood the enemy. And that makes me think of a story that was told to me by a friend of mine. This man here on the right, David Lamb was his name. He was not a soldier. He was a journalist. He covered the Vietnam War, covered combat, 1968 to 1970 for UPI. He returned again in 1975 and covered the fall of Saigon. He died several years ago. He was a wonderful guy, a great storyteller. And one story that he told me and he eventually wrote about was how he loved Vietnam. He loved it. He loved the GIs. He very much supported the war effort. He loved the people he met there, and he loved the Vietnamese. He operated out of Saigon, and he said the fellow Vietnamese journalists that he worked with were fantastic, and his best friend was this guy, Pham Duan An. Now I have to say, Pham, just about every American journalist claimed this guy to be their best friend. So, Pham was a charming, charismatic man. He was a very influential man. He worked as an unofficial military advisor to the U.S. Army. He had spent 11 years as a journalist for the Christian Science Monitor. He had been a journalist for the New York Herald Tribune. And during the Vietnam War for 13 years, he was the bureau chief for Time magazine in Saigon. Every story about the Vietnam War that Time magazine ran during the Vietnam War went through Pham's desk. Pham was so trusted by the military leaders in Saigon that they shared classified information with him. They shared war plans with him. And you know where I'm going with this. They had no idea that Pham was a spy and that he was actually a general in the North Vietnamese army and had been since the 1950s. He would take every document that was passed to him and he would take pictures of it. He would then take the film canister, put it in a ball of rice, wrap the rice in a banana leaf, take the banana leaf to a park in Saigon, do what is called a dead drop. They'd leave it at the park. A fellow insurgent would come, pick up the rice package, disappear into the Cu Chi tunnels, convey the film all the way to the Cambodian border, where it would be taken up the Ho Chi Minh Trail to Hanoi. Within 2 weeks, every document that Pham saw would be shown to the military leaders in North Vietnam. Pham was a spy. This was not known by Americans until the year 1987. Wow. David Lamb, my friend, takes a job in the year 2000 after diplomatic relations have reopened with Vietnam, takes a job in Hanoi in the year 2000 as the Los Angeles Times bureau chief. He gets settled into Hanoi, and he said, I had to look up Pham. He said, and I fantasized, what would I do when I saw him? Would I yell at him? Would I punch him in the face? You know, he said, I felt betrayed. And he said he looked him up, knocked on his door, and Pham answered and said, David, so good to see you, come on in. Offered him a cigarette and a cup of tea. And David said, hey, Pham, I gotta tell you, I'm a little pissed off at you. You know, I mean, I thought we were friends all those years. And he said that Pham just got an astonished look on his face, and he said, of course we were friends. Nothing personal, buddy. You were working for your country, I was working for my country. I loved you guys. I loved it. And he said this, the Americans I dealt with were beautiful people. They were very smart. But being smart and making the right decision are two different things. The big mistake the Americans made was not understanding Vietnamese history, culture, mentality. They were so sure military strength would win the war, they never bothered to learn who they were fighting. And this is Pham holding his press card, or his MACV card, information office card, from 1965. So I thought I conceive of this series as really being, especially the first part of it, as an attempt to understand who we were fighting. Who are the Vietnamese people? And I thought for this first session, I would just address the 5 things you really need to know about Vietnam and the Vietnamese people before you even begin to learn about the war. Just basic, important things. And the number 1 thing is, Vietnam is mostly mountains. 80% of Vietnam is mountains. And I joke the other 20% is water. You know, it is somebody, and I'm always recommending this, if you know a young scholar, there's a book that should be written. And I even have a title for the book. Here's the title, Mountain People. Mountain people are the mountain yards. That's right. We call them mountain yards, which is French for mountain people. Mountain people. There are mountain people around the world, and they're all the same. They're a little weird. They are isolated, they live in small communities, and they tend to be undeveloped. West Virginia. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. Small, isolated communities that don't keep up with cosmopolitan urban communities. And this is the world over. No matter where you go, you find these small communities of mountain people. And Vietnam is just filled with them. This is Vietnam, and you can see it has an unusual geography. It is 1,000 miles long. It's hemmed in on the east by the Gulf of Tonkin and the South China Sea. And it's hemmed in the west by some of the most forbidding mountains in the world. The mountains begin north of the Chinese border, and they extend all the way down to beyond the end of the border with Laos and the beginning of Cambodia right here. These are really forbidding and remote places. So remote that there are large mammals that continue to be discovered living there that Westerners or the outside world doesn't even encounter. There's often an article about it, if you keep up with it, as I do. You'll read about inside Asia's Amazon, which is what these mountains are called, the Annamite mountain range. You have these large, rare, you think it's a deer, it's called a Vietnamese unicorn, but it's related to cattle. You have this thing, a sorrel. I think that there's still debates about what this thing is related to. They don't know what it is. They have determined it's not related to a goat or a sheep at all. But they can't quite find any other relative in the world. This is a gigantic, muscular, wild cattle. There's a cloud leopard, and there are all kinds of then different insects and butterflies and spiders that are discovered, and I mean discovered, in the past 10 years or so. These small groups of mammals live in these isolated communities in the mountains, as do the people. Vietnam. The Vietnamese is only one ethnic group in Vietnam. there are 53 others. They don't speak Vietnamese. They don't dress Vietnamese. They don't worship like the Vietnamese. They have their own, they don't consider themselves Vietnamese. In fact, most of them hate the Vietnamese because the Vietnamese is the majority ethnic group, and the Vietnamese control and own all the good stuff in Vietnam. The mountain people get the mountains. They get their poor mountain villages. They are dressed in, when you go to Vietnam, and we've done 3 trips, the Veterans Breakfast Club, I've done 3 trips with Vietnam veterans to Vietnam. What a fascinating experience this is. We spend some time in the mountains, and we drive up the mountains, and you don't have to go far until you realize, ooh, these people look different. They dress differently, and they tend to love Americans. The Vietnamese love Americans, but the Montagnards, their love for Americans goes back to the war, because most of the Montagnards were on the American side. And I remember our last trip, and I should have put it in the slide deck. I took a picture of a brew, an ethnic group called a brew. And the brew stepped out as we were driving up the hill, and he smiled and he gave me a heart like that. And it was just so you realize, like, wow, man, these have long memories from the war. So this map is of the linguistic groups in Vietnam. The green is the Vietnamese. Everybody else are different linguistic families. So you can see the Vietnamese hug the coast right here. So Vietnam is mostly mountains, and the flat areas are home to the 2 biggest cities. Hanoi in the north, a rich Red River Delta, and Saigon in the south, a rich Mekong Delta. These are the 2 rice baskets of Vietnam. These 2 cities, the 2 capitals, essentially, are about as far apart from each other as Pittsburgh is from Orlando. You get a sense of how big this country is. It's an odd-shaped country. 30 miles at the waist, 1,000 miles long. When children learn how to draw this shape of their country, they learn to conceive the country as a pole with 2 rice baskets at each end, here and here. So they're encouraged to draw it on its side. And the 2 rice baskets are, of course, the Red River Delta and the Mekong Delta, Hanoi and Saigon. These are the 2 places where the wealth of Vietnam is produced. Everything in between, or most of what's in between, is poor. Very hard to even survive an agricultural existence between Hanoi and Saigon, unless you get involved in maritime trade like some cities manage to. Number 2, Vietnam's mortal enemy is China. It's hard to describe the hatred, because hatred is too simple of a word, the hatred that the Vietnamese have for the Chinese. Because it's a word, hatred doesn't encompass the richness of feeling that the Vietnamese have for the Chinese. They really can't stand them because they could never, the Vietnamese, escape them. Here's China in green, Vietnam in orange. It's like your big brother sitting on you. You know? And the Chinese have always viewed Vietnam as part of China, as just the southern extension of China. And the Vietnamese are always aware of that. And the Vietnamese have struggled to maintain its independence from China from long ago. So the Vietnamese are utterly dependent on China, and they resent that dependence. It's a complex relationship, but you have to keep that in mind. The Vietnamese spend a lot of time and money and energy, and they have for hundreds and hundreds of years, demonstrating to the world and to themselves that what we call the Vietnamese people existed long before China. And they did. They have proven that. They have, and I mean scholars around the world who were long doubting whether Vietnam was really very different from China. Now there's no debate about that at all. There is all kinds of evidence, including complicated linguistic evidence, that the Vietnamese language, linguistically, has a completely separate genealogical code than the Chinese language. Really is separate. The Vietnamese do a lot of archaeological digs to uncover the origins of what we might call Vietnamese civilization. And they are able to date the birth of Vietnamese civilization to this creation of this city right north of Hanoi. I mean, it's really part of Greater Hanoi, where the Van Lang civilization was born. A city developed, and in the year 2879 BC. We're celebrating our 250th birthday. Vietnam, and this is true. Vietnam is preparing for its 5,000th birthday in 95 years. They're already thinking about what they're going to do for the 5,000th birthday, and they're very proud of that. And this history is very real to them. Now, the history of this Van Lang civilization, this cradle of Vietnam civilization, was here. Not down here, not here, here, right near Hanoi. This is where those archaeological digs were. This is where the people who spoke ancient Vietnamese lived. They only lived up there. They didn't live anywhere else, only in that circle. So this ancient Vietnamese civilization was tiny, and it was constricted within the city walls of Van Lang. But they thrived for thousands of years until disaster struck. And the Vietnamese can tell you this story like it happened 10 years ago. It was the year 111 BC. China invaded. The Han Dynasty, the first great imperial dynasty of China, decided they're just going to move and take over this area where the Van Lang civilization was. The Chinese didn't call it the Van Lang civilization. They gave this place a new name, Nam Viet. Nam meaning south, Viet meaning the people beyond. The people beyond the south. The barbarians. These are your hick country cousins who live in the mountains of West Virginia. You know what I mean? Oh man, you West Virginians are gonna come up to me and I'm trying to get at analogies here. The Chinese really view the Vietnamese as a bunch of bumpkins. And the Vietnamese are very aware of that. Very aware. And you see them when you travel to Vietnam. There are a lot of Chinese tourists now when you're in a hotel. It's so strange. Oh, the whole thing is so strange. When you go to a hotel in Vietnam, the Vietnamese segregate the Americans and Europeans from the Chinese. And I mean the Chinese get their own floors. They get their own breakfast dining area. They encourage separate elevators. They don't want us mixing with the Chinese. And they want the Chinese completely separate. And the Chinese just are kind of condescending towards the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese just hate it. But anyhow, so for a resistance movement to the Chinese began about 150 years after China took over Vietnam. That resistance movement continued for about 900 years, until finally in this battle of the Bac Dong River, 938 AD, the Vietnamese evicted the Chinese from Vietnam. It's the greatest moment in Vietnamese history. Again, this is an event that's very much remembered and commemorated in Vietnam every day. They think about it every day. You can't walk down the street without seeing a statue to it every day. I mean, in this battle, how they won the battle tells you a lot about the Vietnamese and how they fight war. The battle was won this way. The Vietnamese started staging these little revolts trying to draw the Chinese Army and Navy to Vietnam in large numbers, and they did. In 938 AD, the Chinese sailed 300,000 men in ships. They sailed them up the Bac Dong River. Once they were a little bit up the Bac Dong River, Vietnamese guerrillas started shooting arrows at them, harassing them, and then running up the river. The Chinese pursued the Vietnamese up the river, and then the tide went down, and revealed in the water were these pikes that had been set into the riverbed with iron tips. These pikes got the Chinese boats stuck, and groups of Vietnamese insurgents fired flaming arrows onto the stationary boats. The estimate is about 150 Chinese people were killed in about 3 days of fighting. This is how Vietnam achieved its independence in 938. Through trickery, asymmetric warfare, guerrilla warfare, whatever you call it, you know, they managed to have this victory, and this is very much remembered in Vietnam. You could go to a museum and see them, the pikes, that is, that had been set in the river. Here they are revealed in an archaeological dig. It's really remarkable. And this victory in the 900-year insurgency against the Chinese leads to our third fact about Vietnam, and that is Vietnam, more than any neighboring country, is a warrior culture. These are people who fight. They're used to fighting. They seem to like fighting. They fight. And it's everywhere. You see there's almost a worship of the martial heroes. Because not only once you achieve your independence, you have to keep it. So they had to keep fighting the Chinese over and over again. And so this whole warrior culture emerged, where you have a tiny country fighting a great empire. And when a tiny country fights a great empire, women have to fight. Children have to fight. The elderly, everybody fights. Everybody's a warrior. In fact, the two great founding heroes of Vietnam are two sisters, the Trung sisters. They led the first great rebellion against the Chinese. They were killed, the rebellion failed, but they led a rebellion on elephants. And these Trung sisters are everywhere. You see images of them and statues to, oh man, imagine if that were your wife. I mean, these are strong warrior women, ancient women, and they're very much celebrated in Vietnam. Here are the Trung sisters here, Trung sisters here. You see them everywhere. And they are really second only to the first emperor of Vietnam, the man who achieved victory at the Battle of Bac Dong River in 938, and that is No Quin, and you see him everywhere. He's the founder of Vietnam. You see him as much as you see Ho Chi Minh. There's statues of him everywhere. He's it. He's the guy. He's the founder, and he's a warrior. All he does is fight. You see him in cartoons, he's in children's shows, he's in video games, because, and here's another image of the Battle of Bac Dong River, you see the pikes down here. And it's not only did he defend the country against China and then win independence from China, he then, what other thing that made him great is he used this new great army to conquer other people. For the first time, now that they were free from the Chinese yoke, the Vietnamese expanded south, and they call it the March to the South. They did to other people what the Chinese did to them. The Vietnamese call it the Dai Viet, the Great Viet. They hammered out a land empire east of the Annamite mountain range, all the way down to the Mekong Delta. And they did it in the span of a few hundred years. The Dai Viet. The Dai Viet. And the Dai Viet, very much remembered. There's Dai Viet beer, there's a Dai Viet soap opera. Dai Viet cartoons. I mean, again, everybody remembers it. And, you know, I have to say, this shaped the Vietnam War. This shaped the division of the country at the 17th parallel. The people up north today think of themselves as the real Vietnamese. The people down south, you know, they're a little suspect. They probably speak another language. They may not do ancestor worship right. They make their fa too sweet. You know, they speak wrong, everything about. They don't trust Northerners. Northerners are patriotic, patriarchal, conservative, and communist. They are very Vietnamese. These people in the South, they are intermixed with too many other ethnic groups. They have too much interchange with other countries and other cultures. So they're all a little suspect. Number 4, and this is important, because the Vietnamese had such a reputation for fighters, the Europeans tended to stay away from them. You know, you'll remember the Age of Exploration. You've heard of Christopher Columbus. You've heard of Bartholomew Diaz, who went around the Cape of Good Hope for the first time. Ferdinand Magellan, who circumnavigated the globe in 1522. Vasco da Gama went around the Cape of Good Hope, went to India, the first person from Europe to make the sea trip to India. He's my favorite. When I was in elementary school, I was taught his name was John Cabot. It was Giovanni Caboto. They just call him John Cabot in the textbook because the English hired him to find a sea route to Asia. He ran into Canada and claimed Canada for the British. You know, these guys, they were all, what were they, why were they, it's amazing they circumnavigated the globe in a matter of 75 years. And they did so because they were all looking for wealth. And in the 15th century, 16th century, wealth was gold and silver, jewels, dyes, and pepper. That was it. A bag of black pepper, and I mean the kind of black pepper that you had tonight for dinner, could buy you a really good farm in Europe in the 1500s. It was that valuable. And so they went looking around the world because they were building up armies. Kingdoms were building up armies in Europe to fight to create new nations like Spain and France. They needed the money. And so they were searching the world for spices. They stopped in Vietnam. Portugal did, the Dutch did, the Spanish did. And in logbook after logbook of these explorers, they say, wow, these people are crazy. Like, you land, and all you're trying to do is say hi, and they shoot at you. Not worth it. I don't care what they have, it's not worth it. And so they stayed away. It's much easier to get your pepper in India than it is in Vietnam. So there's really very few Europeans who stop in Vietnam during this age of exploration, except for the brave ones, and the brave ones are the Jesuit priests.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I went to a Jesuit college, and they scared me. They would, because their job was to convert souls, and they were really successful, really doggedly determined and successful. The leader of the Jesuits, the French leader, was Alexander de Rhodes, extremely influential, probably helped to convert about 10% of the Vietnamese population to Roman Catholicism, and that's why Vietnam to this day has a large Roman Catholic population. But then the French tried again. The French came back in the 19th century, and they were brutal. It took, they invaded Vietnam at Da Nang in 1858, and it took them 29 years to conquer all of Vietnam. Why did they do it? They must have really wanted it. If they were willing to fight for 29 years, they did it because Vietnam had the raw materials that their industrial machine needed. Coal, rubber, zinc, tin, and rice even, to feed the growing French Empire. This is a sign from France. This is a French sign from Paris that says Indo-Chinese rice is sold here. So it became, in the early 20th century, a delicacy, Indo-Chinese rice. So it took 30 years to conquer Vietnam, and they did it. And they did it for the raw materials, and we're going to talk about that. Why the raw materials were so needed, and how this desperate search for raw materials just impacted the Vietnamese peasants' lives. That's going to be the subject next time. But I do want to say, in addition to kind of the search for raw materials, the French, they were strange. You know, the French, they, revolutionaries are filled with zeal. Revolutionaries have the truth. Revolutionaries have the way. And they're always trying to convert people to follow them. And so when they take over a colony, they don't do it like the British do. The British, like, you could believe whatever you believe, you could worship your gods, we just want your tea, or we just want your coal. So the British kind of had an easy time. That's why the British were able to build this huge empire upon which the sun never set, because they were able to work with local groups, because they weren't out to really change the locality. The French were different. The French had this thing called a revolution. And so because of that, they wanted to change everything about the places where they colonized. And they changed the name of Vietnam. They changed it to Laos, Cambodia, Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China. We'll talk about that. And they were filled with what they called the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. And you can see it expressed well. Here is France lit up, showing its rays to its colonies around the world, including Vietnam right here. Paul Dumas, who's the first governor general or one of the governor generals of Indochina, said, just as Rome civilized the barbarians beyond its borders, we too have a duty to extend French culture and religion to the backwards people of the world. So that was part of the French mission in Indochina. And to do that, they had to stamp out what they considered Vietnamese. They banned the name Vietnam. Had to be called French Indochina. They banned Vietnamese written language and had to use a Latin alphabet. So this is the same thing written in the original Vietnamese, and this is how you write it in the French invented Vietnamese. And today in Vietnam, almost nobody can read this. Completely, this is the only language that's used in Vietnam today. And this is what, I want to end with this. I love the Vietnamese language. I try, as most like decent tourists, I think it's kind of like a courtesy. When you go to another country, you try to maybe speak the language and hope that they don't answer you when you say something. I learned you can't even try in Vietnamese because it's so easy to screw up. The Vietnamese language is this marvel and this mystery. It is a monosyllabic language. One word, one syllable, that's it. If you think about that, well, you kind of run out of syllables. You know what I mean? You run out of words. How do you use the same, ma? How do you use ma to mean 6 different things? You do it with the tone. It's a tonal language. So when you hear somebody speaking Vietnamese, that's why they're like, up and down, up and down, up and down, because the tones are everything. So it's a monosyllabic language. There are 6 tones, there are 12 vowels, and then many diphthongs and triphthongs. Somebody said it's like singing a language with sounds you never knew existed. And it's really easy to misspeak. So for example, the word ma, M-A, depending on the tone you use, when you say the word, it could mean ghost, butt, cheek, mother, tomb, horse, or rice seedling. It all depends on the tone. So you could think you're saying, good morning, how are you? And you're really saying like, up yours, buddy, get out of my face. You know what I mean? And so it's really dangerous to, and I'll end with this story that I love, this anecdote that I love about a man that you'll remember, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. He was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense. You might remember in 1963, John F. Kennedy himself went to Berlin and gave a great speech, and he ended the speech with the flourish, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner. Robert McNamara gave a similar speech in Saigon in 1964, and he thought he would end the speech with this Vietnamese flourish, "Long live South Vietnam." He tried to say it in Vietnamese, but he flubbed the tones. And what came out was, "The Southern duck wants to lie down." And it's a well-remembered episode by the Vietnamese. Okay, I will be back in 6 weeks and continue the story. Thank you.